Okay, we will just give persons a few minutes to join and we can begin at about 7:05. That's in about 4 minutes. Thank you to everyone who has joined us so far. We will begin in about 2 minutes just to give more persons the opportunity to join the conversation. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for a special edition of Spill the Facts, an online series produced by the International Decade for People of African Descent Assembly Guyana. I'm Elsie Harry, and I will be your moderator for tonight. And my co-moderator is Ms. Tendai McAllister. We are so happy that you have taken the time this Saturday evening to join us for this program. The program is titled Remembering George Floyd, and we are having a conversation on dismantling the global anti-Black system. As protesters call for justice for George Floyd and an end to police brutality and reforms to address the symptoms of anti-blackness or anti-black racism, IDPADA-G thinks it is imperative that we seek to go deeper and to expose the systemic destruction of the Black presence. If the change that we seek is to be lasting, the world must know who we really are and our true contribution to world history. We must remove the layers of misinformation and false narratives that others have used to define us and our presence across the world. We must do this by revisiting and reigniting the resistance movements that have been strangled or extinguished by our oppressors. Step one in this process is to recognize and to restore our legacy. This evening, our speakers will take a deeper look at some of these complex matters by examining the system that was put in place to destroy the Black presence and proposing feasible steps that can immediately be taken to rebuild new systems and new structures for people of African descent. I will allow my co-moderator, Tendai McAllister, to begin introducing our panelists for this evening. Oh, I'm sorry, Tendai got disconnected, so I will continue. Mr. Nicholas Elliott is a final year medical student at the University of Guyana. He has served as the president of the Medical Students Association and is a member of the International Decade for People of African Descent Assembly Guyana Youth Committee. He is a scout leader with the Queen's College Scouts Group, a peer educator, volunteer, and mentor. He's extremely fervent about issues surrounding violence against children and mental health. Nicholas, we are very happy to have you. And I must mention that Nicholas is the youngest member of our panel this evening. Michelle Ya Asantewa is a self-published author who was born in Guyana, South America, right here. She migrated to the UK in 1980 and graduated with first-class honors in English from the University of North London, now London Metropolitan, where she eventually began working as a lecturer teaching English literature. Encouraged by a university professor, Asantewa completed a PhD focused on the Guyanese Comfort tradition, inspired by her African traditional spiritual practices and cultural identity. After a while, Asantewa decided to pursue her own writing talents. The decision came after being rejected by several publishers. She decided to, instead of allowing the rejections to restrict her potential, Asantewa used the knockbacks to spur her on to complete and publish her own works. Eventually, she left lecturing and set up her own publishing company, Way Wive Words. Anthony Browder is an author, publisher, cultural historian, artist, and an educational consultant. He's a graduate of Howard University's College of Fine Arts and has lectured extensively throughout the United States, Africa, Caribbean, Mexico, Japan, and Europe on issues related to African and African-American history and culture. Mr. Browder is the founder and director of IKG Cultural Resources and has devoted 30 years researching ancient Egyptian history, science, philosophy, and culture. He has traveled to Egypt 54 times. That is a lot of times, Mr. Browder, since 1980, and is currently director of the ASA Restoration Project, which is funding the excavation and restoration of the 25th dynasty tomb of Karakomun in Luxor, Egypt. Browder is the first African-American to fund and coordinate an archaeological dig in Egypt and has conducted 23 archaeological missions to Egypt since 2009. Happy to have Michelle Asantewa and Anthony Browder. Our final two panelists are Vibert Cambridge. Vibert Cambridge is a professor emeritus in the School of Media, Arts and Studies, Scripps College of Communication at Ohio University. Dr. Cambridge's teachings, research, and scholarship have focused on communication for development and social change, entertainment education and mass media programming, immigration, diversity, broadcasting, and Caribbean social and cultural history. His current work focuses on the social history of sweet drinks in Guyana, cultural preservation through diaspora engagement, public services, and implementation of the UN's SDGs and citizen engagement in the emerging fourth industrial revolution. His musical life in Guyana has focused on history and politics of control. The first in-depth study of Guyanese musical life was published by the University Press of Mississippi in June 2015 as part of his Caribbean Study series. In 2016, when Guyana celebrated the 50th anniversary of independence, Dr. Cambridge was awarded Guyana's Golden Arrowhead of Achievement for his contributions to the study of Guyana's social and cultural history. In 2013, he received the Award for Excellence in Global Engagement from Ohio University. Our final speaker, Mr. Gabriel Christian. Gabriel Christian Esquire is a native of Dominica and the principal of the law firm Gabriel J. Christian and Associates, LLC in Bowie, MD, USA. Mr. Christian studied law at Georgetown University Law Center in Washington, D.C., and was admitted to the Maryland Bar in 1991. Christian is also a member of the Bar of the Supreme Court of the United States of America. Mr. Christian has distinguished himself as a Caribbean in the Washington area, as an active civic leader in Maryland. In 2007, my apologies, I got disconnected. I'm sorry about that. In 2007, Governor Martin O'Malley, governor of the state of Maryland, appointed Mr. Christian to the position of Judicial Commissioner, Maryland Court of Appeals. Also, alongside his longtime collaborator and co-founder of Point Case Press, Canadian Judge Irving W. Andre, Mr. Christian has authored and co-authored a number of books on Caribbean history, society, and politics. That was a huge mouthful, but now our audience has an introduction to our excellent panel of speakers this evening. In terms of the flow of our discussion, this evening, each panelist will make a 5 to 7 minute opening presentation, which will be followed by a 15-minute discussion, a 15-minute moderated discussion between the panel members, and then the floor will be open for questions from you, our audience. If during the presentations you have questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A section or in the chat section of the Zoom meeting or on our Facebook page, because we are live on Facebook, and those questions will be asked to our panelists. Before we get into the discussion, the term anti-blackness is quite new. And so what I would like us, all of us collectively, the panelists and the audience, to engage in is to documenting aspects of anti-blackness that we feel should form part of the discussion. So we will put up on screen the suggestions that are submitted, and these will form part of the discussion. So which one of the panelists would like to begin to define anti-blackness? Mr. Cambridge, how about you? Would you like to begin?
Well, I could do that. I would like to immediately quote from Dr. Ross, a professor of African American Studies at Northwestern University. She did an opinion piece in the New York Times June the 4th of this year. in which she says anti-blackness is the disdain, disregard, and disgust of our existence. She says anti-blackness describes the inability to recognize and respect Black humanity. It captures a reality of the kind of violence that saturates Black life. And it is not based on any specific thing a Black person did. The violence we experience isn't tied to any particular transgression. It is gratuitous and unrelenting. So in a little nutshell, anti-Blackness is the disdain, disregard, and disgust for the existence of Black people. Would like to extend that by saying it is a contemporary manifestation of a discredited theory of racial superiority, especially the variety known as white supremacy. That is a notion that holds that European people, particularly Nordic or the Aryan category, that they have achieved the highest level of human civilization, and as a result are ordained to direct national governance and accrue the maximum economic and social benefits from the resources of that society. So that's my opening stand.
Thank you, Mr. Cambridge. Mr. Browder, what about you?
Sure. I want to thank Mr. Cambridge for referencing Dr. Ross's article, which is very timely, and I'm appreciative that she has expanded the concept of racism and white supremacy and redefined it as to what it really is. It is anti-Blackness. And by moving away from the terms racism, then what we do is to clarify and be more specific about the negative attention that is meted out to people of African ancestry. Because when you use the word racist, then I've heard ill-informed white people refer to Blacks as being racist. But if we adapt the concept of racism and or white supremacy that was given to us by Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, the key to racism or white supremacy, the key to anti-Blackness is power. So in that context, the power to create laws, the power to establish a police force to impose those laws, the power of creating an educational system designed to miseducate Black people. So if Black people are racist, then one has to ask the question, where do we have the power and the ability to impose our racist views on others? We don't have that power. We've never had that power. And so anti-Blackness, I feel, is an appropriate term for the 21st century to describe systems of injustice that all of us have been living under all of our lives. And the only way that we can dismantle these systems is to begin to become clear of who we are as Black people, i.e. African people, learn to love ourselves as African people, learn to love and appreciate the legacy that African people have bequeathed to the world, and then to live as African people. That begins the process of changing the paradigm.
Okay, so if you were to contribute some key aspects of what you just said to our whiteboard here for the audience, which aspects would you want to contribute?
Anti-Blackness has taught us to hate ourselves as Black people, to hate ourselves as African people. So if we're going to be engaged in the process of anti-Blackness, then we must learn to love ourselves as African people and not try to model our lives after the lives of our oppressors.
Okay, thank you. So to add to Dr. Browder's discussion, what is missing there from his definition is anti-Blackness teaches us to hate ourselves as Black people. Michelle Asantiwa, how do you define anti-Blackness?
I mean, I like that there's a little thing going on for us to almost keep stressing a definition that has already been posed by Dr. Ross and expressed to us through by Dr. Barbara Cambridge and expanded again by Anthony Browder. So my only potentially addition is that it connects with a system of fear that is written and coded in the term Afrophobia. So, and I don't know where that has been positioned in this revitalized, revised, or redefined version of anti-blackness. So I would try to make a connection between the anti-blackness and Afrophobia as well, just like we have the terms anti-Semitic, which come into to speak about the mistreatment of so-called Semites, which is another conversation, obviously. But if we put it in that context, anti-blackness is the equivalent of what the Jewish would refer to as anti-Semitic, or the Zionists would refer to anti-Semitic. So it links to this total fear as well of Africans and all things Africans that we ourselves have imbued, and the world has identified as something that relates to us. That we are people to be despised, we are people to be feared. So that's how my connection with anti-blackness would be expressed.
Thank you. Mr. Christian and Mr. Elliott, do you also have facets to add to this definition of anti-blackness?
All right, Elsie, good evening. First off, thank you very much for the invitation to sit on this lovely panel, and this very diverse and knowledgeable panel, and to share some of my humble opinions on what I think anti-blackness is and how we can, as a community, move off of that. So off of my ruminations, anti-blackness is the manifestation of a philosophy that some persons hold, which tells them that some are innately entitled and others, due to that entitlement, are automatically less than. And so they use that philosophy then to create a system that would perpetuate these ideals and beliefs. So that is, in a nutshell, what I believe anti-blackness to be.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. Mr. Christian.
First of all, Elsie, good evening to you. It's good to see you, and it's good to be again a host of IDPADA-G. And I want to thank Sister Olive Sampson for the outstanding work that she is doing with the International Decade of People of African Descent Assembly, Guyana. I want to also thank the brothers Browder and Cambridge, Brother Elliott, Sister Santua, for the knowledge that they've shared this evening and expanding the circumference of our knowledge. Anti-blackness. Anti-blackness. Anti-blackness, I think, as someone who's of the African diaspora, resides within, number one, a system of imposed and also self-absorbed self-hate. That inferiority complex that was born of our being kidnapped on the coast of Africa, brought to the New World, to create the wealth that, according to Dr. Eric Williams in Capitalism and Slavery, propelled Western industrialization. Self-hate. It is also any system that allows for the disdain of African people, or the disdain shown towards people of African descent, to find manifestation in law and policy. Law and policy in a manner that allows for wealth to be robbed, for cultural rootedness to be denied, and for the continued perpetuation of that inferiority complex to proceed. It also is that system that dehumanizes not only people of African descent, but dehumanizes even the oppressor. And that is why I believe that as
most anthropologists and historians of society place Africa as the origins of mankind, that African people have a special role among all peoples, not to place us on a pedestal, but to say that we have a special role because of our suffering, to be that catalyst for the humanization of all people because of what we have suffered, and so provide a society or societies in Africa and elsewhere where we have a place, where we've created a space so that all persons, all people of all colors can have access to the best that there is in life, equality of opportunity, equal access to justice, and the opportunity to build what Dr. Martin Luther King called the beloved community.
Thank you so much, Mr. Christian. So now that we have context for our discussion, especially for members of our audience to whom this conversation on anti-blackness might be new, we can proceed into the presentations. I will begin with Dr. Cambridge, and our presentations will continue in the order as I'm seeing the speakers listed on my screen. So Dr. Cambridge, we will begin with you, and then Anthony Browder, Dr. Michelle Asantiwa, Mr. Gabriel Christian, and Mr. Nicholas Elliott. In that order, we will begin our presentations, and then we will go right into the discussion. Dr. Cambridge, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ms. Harry. And I joined with my colleagues in expressing thanks to IDPADA-G for mobilizing this moment. I started off my contribution to this moment by citing Dr. Ross. What I'd like to do is to look at some of the manifestations over time of this tradition, of this practice, and then kind of zero into some of its manifestations in the Guyana experience, and even look a little bit at contemporary Guyanese practice. It would be almost redundant to make the point that this idea of a racial hierarchy, that there are some people who are at the top and some people who are at the lower rungs of the ladder. It would be sad for us to note that this emerged out of this period of age of enlightenment back in the 17th century, when we were saying we could bring reason to overcome the horrors of superstition and mystery. But it was in this so-called scientific moment that this concept of a hierarchy of races was articulated. We saw it applied and continued during the Atlantic slave trade. Now, how could you justify all men are equal and then you put some into slavery and you sell them as chattel? Now, you have to create some notion that some were more human than others. We've seen that in the United States of America. The experiences in the United States of America informed Nazi Germany, which we could all agree has been in recent times in this century, in the last century, an example of vicious hate. We've seen it in white Australia policy. We've seen this in South Africa's apartheid. These are all states, national structures that are built upon that notion that it was a hierarchy of people who have higher levels of civilization and therefore have the right to govern, the right to develop institutions, the right to use coercive force, and the right to have access to the benefits of the economic and social resources of that society. We must also look at the practices that have been used to do this. Brother Browder pointed out to us, it's part of an educational system, a miseducation. a system of miseducation. And that is all part of the state coercive power. The use of terror and intimidation to corral us. If we go into the world of cinema and cultural artifacts, the great modern movie, Birth of a Nation. What was the narrative behind Birth of a Nation? You've got a bunch of uppity Black folks who need to be put in their place. Intimidation, the use of propaganda. And propaganda is a very interesting strategy. It involves the creation of myths and stereotypes and caricatures. And for us in Guyana, our plantation, that thing that, that molded the society that we were in. It was there, some of the myths and stereotypes and caricatures of people of African ancestry were nurtured and transmitted across our society. Today, looking at that media environment, we must look at the virtual violence that is taking place on social media. A particular concern about this structure or strategy for anti-Blackness, we must look at the acts of erasure, how you are systematically erasing the Black experience out of the world experience. And only a few days ago, there was a conversation on Facebook about rice in Guyana. And one individual got so virulently aggressive to totally deny history, botany, scientific evidence, anthropological evidence that people of African ancestry brought with them to the Americas, North America, Central America, the Caribbean, and South America, a particular species of rice, which is still cultivated today in places like Suriname and Cayenne. These acts of erasure are quite important. And when we talk about strategies for counteracting anti-Blackness, we must be strategic in how we address these issues of erasure. A little bit later on, we will look at how these manifestations operationalize themselves in Guyana. The Guyanese historian, I think he's from Michel's University, London Metropolitan, Clemcy Charan, speaks about something called comparative likeness. That within this structure of a hierarchy, the whiter you are, the more privileged you are. And in the Caribbean, there has been a notion called comparative likeness. If we take our minds back to the schoolyard, and Ms. Harry, this may not have happened during your time, and hopefully it didn't happen during your time. But in my days in the schoolyard, there was a little ditty that was sung. If you're Black, stand back. If you're brown, stick around. If you're white, it's all right. That summarized the social and cultural dynamics of the society. A Madrasi Indian, a dark-skinned Indian from Madras, was not considered of the same caste or of same status of a fair-skinned North Indian person. And this happened within the dynamics of the plantation experience for our Indian brothers and sisters. People from Madeira were not even considered European. We still today talk about the 7 races of Guyana, the 6 races of Guyana. And you talk about Europeans and Portuguese. So as we look at the manifestations of anti-Blackness in our society, and we look at how these things became normalized, one could see Brother Browder's point about self-doubt emerging, self-hate, self-loathing emerging. We can see people becoming proxies for whiteness and and swallowing lock, stock, and barrel these negative stereotypes, these caricatures, these myths about people of African ancestry. So that's my opening gambit, that as a strategy, it has a long set of manifestations, and there's some tactics that have been used and are still used, and we need to understand that constellation of reality as we develop strategies to move forward to counter this pernicious thing that's called anti-blackness. That's my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cambridge. And unfortunately, I have to report to you that what you heard in the schoolyard was what I heard in the schoolyard as well.
Wow.
So that is in fact still in existence, unfortunately. Mr. Anthony Browder, the floor is yours.
So our topic for tonight is Black Lives Matter, remembering George Floyd, a conversation on dismantling the global system of anti-blackness. So I'd like to give some context for my contribution, my opening remarks, by talking about my life and putting my life in context or contrast to the themes. I was born in Chicago, Illinois, 69 years ago. Chicago had a reputation when I was growing up that still holds true today. Chicago is the most racially segregated city in the United States of America. I've lived my entire life in the United States of contradictions. This country, literally, the leadership of this country has always spoken with a forked tongue. They said one thing, but that meant and they did something totally different. So if we're gonna dismantle the system of global anti-blackness, let's understand clearly how it shows up in our life. So I want to use my life as an example. I was 4 years old when Emmett Till was killed. Emmett Till was from Chicago. I was 10 years old when I first became aware of prejudice and discrimination. And it shocked me to my core to think that there were people in the world, in my community, who hated me simply because of the color of my skin. I was 14 years old when Malcolm X was murdered. I was 15 when Dr. Martin Luther King moved to Chicago in an effort to protest housing in Chicago and how people of African ancestry were being discriminated against. And I remember very clearly when Dr. King protesting in Marquette Park, which is the racist part of the city. He had rented an apartment, and as he was coming in with his colleagues, he was hit in the head with a brick thrown by a group of angry white folk. And I remember Dr. King saying on the news that evening that he has encountered racists in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, all throughout the South, but he had never encountered the degree of racism that he experienced in Chicago. It shocked him to his core. I was 17 years old when Dr. King was assassinated, and I watched my community on the west side of Chicago burn to the ground. And 52 years later, that community has not been rebuilt. I was 18 years old when the Black Panther leaders of Chicago, Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, were murdered in their bed in their apartment on the west side of Chicago, not far from where I lived. As a young man growing up in Chicago, I was harassed by the police regularly. So I came to accept that as a part of life. With the exception of high school, I spent my entire educational career in predominantly Black schools and trained, educated by predominantly Black teachers. I came to Howard University in 1971. I graduated from Howard in 74, but it was 3 years after I graduated from Howard in 1977 that I met Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, who had just published his book, They Came Before Columbus, The African Presence in America, talked about the fact that Africans had traveled to the Americas 2,500 years before Christopher Columbus, and those Africans came from Egypt and the Egyptians were Black. Hearing Van Sertima give this testimonial rocked me from my psychic center because I have been taught all of my life by people who look like me that the Egyptians were white. Everything that I had read in every book, everything that I had seen in every film reinforced this lie. So it was in 1977, 3 years after college, that I began to become aware of the fact that I had been miseducated. And I also became aware of what I refer to as forbidden knowledge. There is information that has never been taught to Black people in America, and I dare say probably around the world. There is information that is not being taught to white people or Hispanics or Asians in America to this very day. This is forbidden knowledge. And once I became aware of the existence of this knowledge, I decided to devote my life and my time to learning what I had never been taught. And this discovery, this immersion into African history and culture has changed the trajectory of my life forever. I made my first trip to Egypt with Dr. Ben in 1980. And those 13 days that I spent on the Nile changed my life forever, and that I saw the physical evidence that had been denied me throughout my entire education. And I realized that I was going to have to assume responsibility to enlighten my brothers and sisters. And so we're in the position that we're in because our ancestors have been stolen from their homeland. Their memory has been erased, and the erasure has been forgotten. We've been given the religion of our oppressors. We've been given the education of our oppressors. We've been given the value system of our oppressors, those people who hate us simply because we are Black. So there's no way on earth that we could ever redeem ourselves and reclaim those things that have been taken from us and outlawed by modeling the examples given to us by our oppressors. So the point that I want us to be clear about, a couple of brief points and then I'll end on this. In the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, there's an exhibition. And in that exhibition, it's in the David Koch Hall of Human Origins. And in that exhibition, they state that 200,000 years ago, Africans were the only people on the planet. And that approximately 60,000 years ago, a group of Africans walked out of East Africa, into Eastern Asia and populated Asia. Approximately 40,000 years ago, another group of Africans walked west into Western Asia, the landmass that we now call Europe, and populated Europe. So if we understand that simple historical reality, the first human beings were African, the first people in Asia were African, the first people in Europe were Africans. The key point is this: geneticists have just found the gene of African people that mutated, the gene in our skin that mutated from African to Caucasian. And that gene is only 7,000 to 8,000 years old. So what that means is that the people who have been oppressing us have only been on the planet 7,000 to 8,000 years. Africans have been on this planet at least 200,000 years. So we have at least a 192,000 year head start on our oppressor. So that's 192,000 years of history and culture and theology, socialization processes that we as African people need to tap into, learn, master, and incorporate into every single thing that we do. And I submit to you, brothers and sisters, that the extent to which we claim our African heritage, practice African principles, is the extent to which we will be free and ultimately gain the respect of those people who have been oppressing us.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Browder. And the first time I met you, I was able to listen to your story about Ivan van Sertima, and I felt proud because, of course, he is Guyanese. So thank you for sharing that with us tonight. Dr. Michelle Ya Asantewa, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Wow. I mean, it's been beautiful listening to Dr. Cambridge and my doctor, Anthony Browder, and my brothers. And I want to extend thank you to, for this invite as well. I must say it was short notice, so I didn't have enough time. I knew about this on Thursday, just after I'd come off of a workshop. So I didn't have total time to gather everything that I would have liked to. But I do want to focus specifically on Guyana and deal with in terms of how we're understanding anti-blackness and that lack of self. And particularly then on the total system. So one aspect of several aspects that relate to the dehumanization of Africans. And that is part of my research and my practice. And that is Comfort, Guyanese Comfort. So this is just one branch of a bigger system that has been part of the dehumanization. This is our spiritual practice that we have, that we came with from when we were stolen and trapped into from Africa. Guyanese Comfort as a total system, that is embedded in the Guyanese village movement. And I'm speaking deliberately because I want to be clear to our people that are listening on Facebook who absolutely know about Comfort, but don't really know about Comfort, and perhaps don't know how that has been an aspect of this whole dehumanization. I'm just using one aspect of a bigger thing. And I want to mention here, while I can, my mentor, who is Baba Menez de Grio, who might be listening on here, but he's a Comfort practitioner. He's also out of the Ifa from Yoruba tradition. And sometimes when we're having these conversations, we are going to seriously have to start including some of these traditional practitioners as well, because I've seen several of these discussions, and to be fair, they are removed. And this is part of this anti-blackness, this is part of this divorce, is that our traditional practitioners, our priests, were marginalized and continue to be marginalized into this day and age. And we have to keep fighting for that recognition of something that is actually innate, it's spirit. And what they were not able to do, though they obviously were trying, was to break that spirit. That spirit still is there. So I wanted to actually also begin just quickly as well with a quotation from one of our elders who equally should be involved in these discussions, or all of our elders as well as our young people, is UC Guyana. I'm talking here specifically on Guyana now. Remember, I'm focusing on Guyana. And UC Guyana has written a book called The Emancipation, Post-Emancipation, the legend is called Post-Emancipation Villages in Guyana, The Making of World History. So it's phenomenal that the book is showing how the post-emancipation village movement can contribute to the narrative around world history in terms of how those villages organize themselves. And this quotation here talks about what the book covers. And it says the topics covered include early African credit banks, race relations, Black newspaper publications, drainage systems, diversification, the thatched houses and their upgrades, rate wars, women in village life, folk diplomacy, petitions as a means of struggle, which underlines the absence of reparations for slavery, the impact of ordinances, that is the pre-independence equivalence of acts of parliament on villages, village education, the role of religion, cultural aspects of village life, including comfort, and many, many more historical patterns and vignettes and facts is covered in this book. So we have really been led as Africans into a forced, unwholesome compromise that continue to impact us, particularly spiritually, obviously psychologically, socially, as well as economically. And the comfort system, which is embedded in the village movement. In other words, we have the village movement and all the attempts to own land, to divorce ourselves from the colonial system and the plantation system, yeah, included our spiritual practices, included what we understood to mean God, included what we knew of honoring and respecting our ancestors. And when we're going to start having, you know, like Dr. Browder or Brother Browder, I know I see you, think of you as Dr. Browder. you know, mentioned the 195,000 years or however many, yeah? That for African people is genetic memory that science equally has now caught up with and expressed to us is significant, and in terms of us tracing back and understanding and feeling that connection with our ancestral past. And we obviously that's going back now to how we organized ourselves, how we created structures for our development, how we understood the value of women, how we recognized you know, agricultural systems, what we use to develop agricultural forms. And so when we now connect back, as Dr. Browder was mentioning, when we connect back, these are some of the things that we are going to have to reimagine, reinterpret, and incorporate into strategies for our progression. I was quite pleased to hear a personal account, because it is personal as well as collective. And one of those systems for Africans was the collectivism. The fact that Africans post-emancipation were able, after being forced into an apprenticeship scheme, to then save money, plantation to plantation, and buy lands on which they can then develop their agriculture, buy lands with the money that they made after working 7.5 hours, and the overtime is the money that they use to collectively pool their resources. We're going to have to start having these conversations about really what Africans just in this locus of Guyana were doing and showing as a model for development. And that development was one of those things, was also about including the village in the conversation, having discussions among the villagers. When I say villagers, I'm talking about the people, the ordinary people, which is why in this book is David Hines, but he's talking to UC Guyana. He is really talking about those village people, the village people out of which every single Guyanese has come. You know, and if we take that, extrapolate that as a metaphor, the whole world are villagers, because they've come from the major village that is Africa. That is why one of our idioms is a village educates the child. Well, at the moment, you know, given what Dr. Browder just told us, Europeans are in a serious state of infancy. They're in a serious state of infancy, and they need that education. But most of all, we need to access the genetic memory that will link us back to that greatness from which we have come. And, you know, this is an aspect that of our dehumanization, is just not being aware of that, the extent of the history. It did not start with slavery. And that's all I mean, there's other bits, but we'll come to that in the discussion. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Ya Asantewa. And as we speak about Brother UC Guyana, I remember back in 2014 or 15, I had the opportunity to interview him about the village movement. And currently in Guyana at Austin's bookstore, and I just saw this last evening on Facebook, there is a book by Brother UC Guyana called Victoria's Historic Model of Village Governance. So I would encourage the persons that are listening here to purchase that book, so that it's just an excerpt. So you can purchase that as a start so that you can read some of Brother UC's work on the village movement. Thank you so much, Dr. Asantewa, Ya Asantewa. Mr. Gabriel Christian.
Yes, ma'am. I'm here.
Yes, we can see you. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. So, you know, this is so rich, and in this moment, I want to remember someone who I could have met when I was 14 years, but I did not, because the government of the day, which was a Black government, and I say this because we must not ever make the mistake to believe that goodness grace, and kindness reside only within the breast of Black people. Some of the strongest pro-Black, anti-racist people I've met have been Jewish, have been Indian, have been white. In fact, I dare say that a surgeon in the Americas and in the Black diaspora, victories that we have won would not have been maybe achieved as quickly had it not been the grace, the consciousness, the humanitarian reaching of persons like the like of John Brown, of Harper's Ferry, and those who fell with him, including several of his sons. There is always this danger as we strive for Afrocentricity in falling into the cul-de-sac of what I call Afrocentric exclusionary thinking. Because as we speak, in Prince George's County, we have political office that is occupied by Black folk. As we speak in Africa, we have folk who are melanated, who hold political office, and who visited wanton cruelty of those of our own kind because they've resided, as in the Tutsis and the Hutus I've represented in my office, as in the Bamileke of Cameroon, and those who are from Bafoussam and Bamenda who are now in a bloody civil war, killing each other, where they have not realized and accepted their own human core, the human core value that I believe a true Pan-Africanist, a true Black power advocate understands the humanity of all Palestinians, the humanity of all Jews, the humanity of all Chinese, the humanity of all East Indians, even where those persons, some of them on occasion, have lapsed into this sort of Nazi or fascist or Zionist thinking, or Apanjata, as they say in Guyana, thinking that has diminished our commonality. So in this moment, I want to remember Dr. Walter Rodney, because Dr. Walter Rodney was invited to Dominica in 1975 by the Black Power movement, and he was a great son of Guyana. He wrote the epic of Europe Underdeveloped Africa. But because of the nature of the time where Forbes Burnham had a relationship with our government, and because the Black Power movement was seen as disruptive of the colonial structure of thinking, he was declared persona non grata. I never got to see Walter Rodney. Great loss. Another person declared persona non grata by a Black-led government was Stokely Carmichael, another great son of the Caribbean, who coined the term Black Power in that Mississippi Freedom Summer, where he parted ways with Dr. King in many respects and went the ways of the Black Panther Party for self-defense, which in great many respects, in its defiance against the odds and its adoption of military means, is something that I was inspired by and still remain inspired by. But I want to make a few points about political power and dismantling what we call white supremacy. The mission and duty of every Afrocentric, every Black loving human being who loves humanity is upon ascending to power, is to operate those levers of power to educate our people, to organize our people, and to be honest, integrity-driven, and kind, because we are damaged goods. The kidnapping of our people, our surgeon in the Americas, the mental slavery that Bob Marley spoke of has eviscerated a lot of the pride that we should have. So any Black leader who is a mayor in any big city in the United States, who is a leader in any African nation, who is the president of an HBCU, as in Howard University, or the University of Maryland Institute Show, has an absolute responsibility to understand that he or she is where he or she is because of thousands and tens of thousands of our people who've died and sacrificed themselves for that dispensation. Number one, how do we dismantle white supremacy? Two, that we create justice systems that are impartial, that we do not become that which we criticize. We were and still are victims of a so-called criminal justice system, what I often call the criminal injustice system, which is a conduit for the prison industrial complex, where tens of thousands of my race occupy rather the jails of the United States of America. So we have a duty, if we ascend to the position of judge or judicial commissioner, to make sure we choose people who are conscious, who are committed to humanity, who are committed to equality of opportunity, who are committed to fair play. The justice system must reflect the community over which it governs and must do so in a manner impartial and respecting of the deficits that some communities, as in Aborigines, as in indigenous people, Native Americans, African Americans, Indo-Guyanese, for instance, have faced because of our lack of power over hundreds of years. Education. The Miseducation of the Negro is a book that we shall all read. Because in the Miseducation of the Negro, we grasp the centrality of control, that colonialism prospered atop, and that was, as Bob Marley said, if you control someone's mind, then you pretty much have won the day. And his message to us was, liberate yourself from mental slavery, for only yourself can free your mind. So we as Pan-Africanists must be constant gardeners of the mind. We have to find Brother Browder, Sister Sandra, Brother Cambridge, Brother Elliot. We have to find a way within the shortest possible time to prosper those bonds between historically Black colleges and universities in the United States, the University of the West Indies, the University of Guyana, universities like of Valle in Colombia, of Choco in Colombia, which is 80% Black on the border of Ecuador, and Colombia and Brazil, 80% Black, that section of Colombia. Universities in Africa, so we can have within the shortest possible time, perhaps with the outstanding leadership of IDPADA-G, convene such a forum where we have our educators, people like Brother Browder, Brother Cambridge, Sister Santua, the young medical doctor or doctoral student, Brother Elliot, in the same space that we have seized by dint of anti-colonial struggle, by dint of civil rights struggle. We were not gifted it by dint of, yes, indeed, the US Civil War and the martyrdom of Abraham Lincoln and all those who died before him like John Brown. We have that space now. We're not where we want to be, but by God's grace, we're not where we used to be. I grew up as a British colonial. My father served in the British Army. On our book covers was a picture of the King and Queen of England in all their royal regalia, training us to be loyal British subjects. Our parents were taught to sing, Britannia, Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. We, the British, shall never be slaves. Maybe Brother Browder remembers that song because he maybe is a little senior to me. But the reality is we have come out of that condition. And one of the most powerful books I read as a youngster was Seize the Time by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. And I remember, and I've referenced the killing of Brother Fred Hampton, who was only 21. Sometimes I shake my head when I think how much that brother was able to accomplish in such a short space of time. And his death was mandated because of his incisive intellectual mastery of alliance building. In a famous clip that I've seen, he goes into a meeting with all whites and a few Asians. And Brother Fred Hampton, who was the chairman of the Chicago Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, says, and I quote, "White power to white people, brown power to brown people, yellow power to yellow people, and black power to black people." What he was doing that the FBI realized was he was building an alliance of the dispossessed of all races to overthrow the system of class oppression and racial prejudice and white supremacy. And he was succeeding because of his eloquence, and that marked him for death. But the spirit of Brother Fred Hampton and Brother Mark Clark are with us, as with Brother Walter Whitney. Those spirits are with us at this moment, as the people in the United States and around the world are standing up to dismantle. As we dismantle, I just come back as I close with this one mission, the education mission, because it's the embrace of that mission to organize our people, and educate our people, especially in the sciences. We will be able to do what Dr. King and the others always wanted us to do, and that is to overcome.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Mr. Christian. And as you spoke about the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda, I remember an experience I had just last year where I met a young woman from Rwanda, and the first question that she always got at school in China was, "Are you a Hutu or a Tutsi?" And I found that that was very inconsiderate. And she said to them, "I'm Rwandese," or President Kagame sees us all as Rwandese. And for me, that was powerful. And I'm happy that she was able to boldly declare that they are one people. So I just wanted to say that. Our final presentation for this evening comes from Mr. Nicholas Elliott. Nicholas, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Elsie. And my presentation would more be focused on how we can move forward from all the things that the previous speakers have highlighted that we have experienced as a people, right? And what I'd like to say is that during the 52 years that we were graced with the physical presence of that Jamaican Marcus Garvey, he managed to exemplify what Black leadership should be like. And some might say that it was ahead of his time, and others might have disagreements with some of his ideologies. But his ideologies for Black pride, nationalism, and economic empowerment in some ways served as the precursors for the civil rights movement. And in his time, he was able to see the manifestation of some of these ideologies, particularly with the formation of his Black Star Line, which was the shipping company. And Garvey can be remembered as saying that until the Black man can produce what the white man can produce, then you can never truly consider us to be equals. It's a controversial, but still a profound statement. And in some ways, the values of economic liberation resonated with our ancestors. And Sister Yasanto spoke earlier of the spirit of collectivism. And so I'd like to talk about a formal manifestation of that collectivism, which was our cooperative system. So emerging from the colonial era, cooperatives were seen as the principal vehicle for propelling the Black man forward, and by large, the Guyanese society, by changing the fundamentals of the then existing systems, which were economic and social structures designed for white and light empowerment. Cooperatives describe a jointly owned and democratic enterprise that was founded on the values of self-help, self-responsibility, and solidarity. And history has aptly recorded how the freed Africans took the money that they had managed to save in wheelbarrows and pay for the purchase of plantations along the coastline of Guyana. The first of those plantations being Plantation Northbrook, which they later then developed further into the village of Victoria. And in August 1905, the villagers of Victoria had successfully launched their cooperative credit bank to further develop their village. The development of these plantations bought by the ex-slaves in the 1830s and 1840s were the earliest models of what cooperatives in Guyana would have been like, and by large, the world. Our ancestors did not make cooperativism a slogan that they walked around with, but instead, like with the Black Lives Matter movement that we're seeing, they committed their entire spirit and being towards the lifestyle and towards that community, which otherwise would have made navigating in a ruthless and unforgiving world unimaginable. Later on in 1895, the International Cooperative Alliance adopted the spirit of cooperativism and managed to establish the longest running co-op with over 1.2 billion members. And even the United Nations began to adopt these systems, and they recognized the importance of cooperatives when they established themselves the UN Federal Credit Union for its members. And it was the spirit of ethos of cooperativism that led Guyana in 1970, after its independence, to declare itself and to create the world's first cooperative republic, based on that same spirit and values of cooperativism, as an economic model that had the potential to empower the marginalized, to promote social inclusion, and yet maintain viable business enterprises and models. Early examples of financial cooperatives, as with the village movement, were all rooted in a thorough understanding of the Black position, our strengths, our needs, and our shortcomings. And with that post-colonial mindset of resilience, national institutions such as the Cooperatives Co-op College were set up also. They aimed at nurturing this spirit of cooperativism, but while addressing that lack of formal training, they provided technical and professional training that was necessary to catalyze entrepreneurial ventures. But where are some of these institutions gone? And why is it that we seem to not know of them? They've either lost their relevance or seemingly disappeared into the ether altogether. But if we are to examine and honestly examine, we would find that more times than not, the answer lies with leadership. Leadership that either lack the internal transparency due to poor reporting or poor bookkeeping or some other factor, or leadership that lacked the guile that was necessary to navigate financial markets that are dominated by a group of well-organized, rapacious competitors whose philosophy regarding business is oftentimes inconceivable and totally different from the African philosophy. So we have a hard time understanding it. But this sort of leadership that led to the declining of cooperatives, of formal cooperatives in Guyana, it does not represent the entire Black community of Guyana. It does not mean that there is a lack of skill, right? But it means that in the time when these systems existed, there were other global events such as the Cold War, which was after the European Civil War, or what we call a World War, right? And that resulted in persons migrating to yonder shores. And when we consider that there was a lack of high-speed internet and online working platforms, we can see then that working from abroad would have posed a lot of challenges. But this is the Black experience that I'm talking about. We have a well-understood history of financial disenfranchisement. But on the other side of that coin, we've managed seemingly unsurmountable financial feats, like purchasing villages, all right? And this goes back to the teaching of Marcus Garvey, where he encouraged us not to just unduly whine or complain among ourselves, but instead collectively put heads one with another to see what can be done to remedy the state of our affairs. And he goes on to say that if we take our hardships and we cradle them onto our bosoms, they will certainly grow from the nourishment thereof. And so the success of any future cooperative, in my opinion, would be hinged on its members, efficient, reliable members that will all times put values of honesty, integrity, and commitment to the cause, to the Black cause, at the helm of all endeavors. And in his book on how to unlock your genius using Black history, David Simon explores action points on how we can do just that, how we can extract our Black history to understand and develop ourselves. And first, he says, open institutions. And I'm not sure if I have the correct pronunciation, but uhuru, it's Swahili, and it means the freedom, right? And freedom means not just freedom from oppression, as in chattel slavery, but freedom to control your entire affairs, freedom to control your life and your being. He then goes on to say that after we've managed to open institutions to guarantee freedom, we need to develop ourselves, personal development, because we can't expect to develop a society when we ourselves are lacking. After we've developed ourselves, we then take the lessons to develop our communities. And this is where many of us are in Guyana. And after you've developed that community, you need to constantly evaluate and reassess that development to make sure that what is happening is relevant to the prevailing circumstances of that era. And so he suggested that we use the acronym GENIUS. You look at the goals, you look at sustainable enterprises, make sure that there's negritude, make sure you have constant investment, look for unseen circumstances or situations, and always find solutions. And as we can see with the movements that are before us and that have manifested from 2014 up until now, the global environment is becoming more favorable to that resurgence of an ideal of collective and cooperativism, right? And that was seen with the failure of the capitalist system in the North to adequately provide and address the need of all of its people. It could be the system, it could be how that system was structured, as in the premise that system was built on. And we've also seen the failure of certain other systems in the East. But I think it is time for us as Blacks to realize the utility of working together and the utility of sharing knowledge among our community. The time is now for us to demonstrate our financial strength in a show of numbers against this adversity of poverty, and for us to spend our dollars, our hard-earned Black dollars that oftentimes we have earned for ourselves because the system has made it such that we hardly inherit these dollars, to spend these dollars with intention. And for us to move forward and upward out of this situation, we must demonstrate, as with this movement, that through collective action, we will no longer commit to financial servitude. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Elliott, for that presentation. And as we're on the matter of cooperatives and coming together, one of the key things that we are proud of at the International Decade for People of African Descent Assembly Guyana is the recent launch of our cooperative credit union. So we are keeping that principle alive. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for your contributions. And at this time, the floor is open for panelists to have a discussion about the things that you would have each said. You would have each offered different and in some cases similar perspectives on the issue of dismantling the global anti-Black system. And this is the opportunity for you to comment on what has been said by your colleagues or to offer any additional information that you might have. Also, for the persons who are in attendance, you may also type your questions in the chat box and in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen.
If I may just quickly say something, Sister Elsie, because it's important, I think, when we have such great minds around the table, for us to find a way to have specific deliverables that are, at least we can sow the seed for, and hopefully that seed can germinate into a fruitful plant. It would be almost myopic of us to not consider we're in the midst of a global pandemic, COVID-19. And one of the things that really touched me was that we had African nations depending on the CDC. The Center for Disease Control here in the United States was set up by the United States for the United States. That is not to say that the United States has not shared its bounty on occasion with others. But now we have about 50 plus African nations. Each of those African nations have universities. We are now working with the University of Congo-Kinshasa. Congo-Kinshasa was the first country in Africa to have a nuclear reactor. At that time, it was a Belgian colony, and Belgium was part of NATO. So Eisenhower, in '54, gave them a reactor. The reason I mention this is, there's absolutely no reason why we ought not to have an African laboratories network that is run on internet protocol where they share different competences. So African laboratories may do X, laboratories in Senegal may do Y, those in Kenya, Z, Ethiopia, C, D, E, whatever the case may be. But that they could ally their respective competences so that there are indigenous African based laboratory science systems in place to address COVID-19 and other things like tsetse fly disease, malaria, and the other. It is, to me, ludicrous to say you have an independent nation where you have a flag, you have an anthem, and you have to yield your primacy in your country to make decisions about your science and technology to others when you have neighbors with whom you can relate and you can meet and you can then found those institutions that will carry us into the end of this century and beyond, and the stars, if I may say. So I believe a good deliverable from this panel would be a commitment wherever we can, with IDPADA-G perhaps, to sow that seed of the idea of an African, a global Academy of Arts and Sciences, where our artists or writers, and certainly the African Laboratory Network can come together and bring forth real solutions so we are not encouraging the continued dependence of others for the things we need to do for ourselves. And that is the Garvey spirit, I think, that Brother Elliott sought to speak about. Thank you.
I'd like to speak to the issue of miseducation in regards to anti-blackness and the power of miseducation. I've been privileged to have lived here in Washington, D.C. for over 40 years, which is where Carter G. Woodson lived. His office is not too far from where I have my office. And I have come to truly understand how miseducation has manifested itself within the African community, and more specifically, according to what Dr. Woodson wrote about, within educated Black folk. I also live in Prince George's County, which is where Christian lives. Prince George's County is the largest minority county in the world. Prince George's County has the highest concentration of wealthy Black people and educated Black people on the planet. But in all seriousness, Black folk in Prince George's County, with all that wealth, with all that education, don't really own anything of value. I have watched with great concern how children within the Prince George's County school system continue to be miseducated under the misleadership of Black folk, miseducated Black folk. And so if we're going to be serious about charting a way forward for ourselves, we have to begin with the process of re-educating ourselves. And I'll close on this point. It was at least 20 years after I graduated from Howard University that I realized that in Howard University's charter, it states that Howard University was established by the white members of Congress for their mulatto children in order to train the first generation of Black folk out of slavery. So that institution was established in order to produce miseducated Negroes who would continue to serve their former masters. And fast forward to the present time. As much as I love Howard University, I reserve the right to criticize Howard University for what they aren't doing. At Howard University, there is no recognition whatsoever for William Leo Hansberry, one of our greatest scholars, no recognition for Dr. Chancellor Williams, another brilliant scholar, no recognition for Dr. Francis Cress Welsing. These brilliant scholars, African-centered scholars, have been marginalized at Howard University for daring to think independently and try to train Black students to free their minds and think independent. So we have to be clear about the fact that, as I think my brother Christian was alluding to some extent, just because you have Black skin doesn't mean you're for Black people. And there needs to be specific standards by which we will measure our contributions to our people. And I'll close with this line from Dr. John Higbee Clark, which means so much to me. If you begin your history in slavery, then everything that happens since then looks like progress. Right? So we have been operating off of a false narrative. Our history does not begin with our enslavement by our European oppressors. Our history begins at the beginning of humanity, and there are multiple resources that we need to begin to avail ourselves of. And in the spaces where we have control, we need to create sacred spaces where we can begin to infuse our young children, as young as possible, with the truth about themselves, who they are and what they have the capacity to do. And so that to me is probably the most important issue that confronts us right now, to begin the process of re-educating ourselves based on centering ourselves within an African-centered framework, which also includes African concepts of God and African spirituality, because I have come to understand that there's no way Black people, wherever they may find themselves in the world, can free themselves praying to the gods of their former enslavers. That is not going to happen. So it's about developing historical consciousness and the courage to live your authentic self.
Thank you so much.
Well said.
Thank you. Can I come in a minute? I mean, I totally agree with all of my brothers, actually. My brothers, I feel, all right, yeah. Just realized that I'm the only sister that's panelist. Yeah, so I agree. It's about that beginning of challenging and subverting the false ideas and the activities of African as well, Africans post-emancipation particularly, going back to what I was saying earlier. One of the things that we need to understand is that Africans are not, never have been lazy. We have been always willing, able, and capable of work and organizing. So what happened, or the ideas that would come down to us as Africans being lazy, was because, and this must be understood, the same independence that Brother Browder is talking about, that independent spirit is actually something that is embedded within us, to come up with new ways of doing things, come up with thinking outside of a box. How can we strategize differently? We need to draw from that. We need to draw from some of the things that are embedded within us. Once we start grounding ourselves in our ancestral power, and knowing that we are independent, our spirit matters to us, we will then come up with some solutions that are necessary. So we were not lazy, we were organized. What Europeans considered us to be lazy, or why they considered us to be lazy, because we no longer we down tools to work on their plantations. We didn't want to work for them anymore for free. So we need to get that right. We also need to think in terms of what land means, having our own access to lands and access to resources means, and indeed what resources mean. Resources in its totality. And again, Brother Gabriel, you were mentioning, I think it was Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. That is a seminal book that, let's just take it right back to Guyana again. That book is not studied anywhere in Guyana. We just had, Walter Rodney is a scholar of international report. And likewise, as Brother Browder was saying about the lack of credit given to these scholars. We don't need to keep reinventing wheels. We have scholars, we have experiences of our elders, we have systems, we have traditions. We need to just start taking these seriously and tapping into that. We have historical experiences of, somebody put in there about revolutions, and how do we strategize? Well, we've been trying to do this for a long time. Brother Gabriel mentioned about Fred Hampton. That we have examples of how to move and create revolution, the process of revolution, or keep the process of revolution going. And if some of us want to know, we can look at examples of Thomas Sankara in his 4 years in Burkina Faso and what he was trying to do, if we're taking it outside. So we need to just use those Pan-African based models and just reincorporate them into our locus. It's called scientific socialism as well. And we need to start engaging with those terms. We need to start engaging with the term that we have just believe are those, the right in the privilege of the mind of academics and scholars. Imperialism is a term that we need to get our heads around because it impacts us. Neocolonialism is something we need to get our heads around because it impacts us. Pan-Africanism is something that we need to embrace and understand and stop doing this cognitive dissonance thing. We're deliberately contributing to our own dehumanization now. But we don't need to, and rightfully, yeah. At the moment, there's this move to eradicate the monuments, the statues, and so on. Yes, that's all well and good. And there's a call for us to have, certainly in the UK, teach Black history in British schools and universities. Well, I'm really for why are we going into broken models? And why are we going to give our asset, which is that our abilities, our skills, our resources to those systems? What will happen is, and we need to try and understand this, is if we say, okay, because we have been doing this throughout our history, is giving the package, the asset which have been us, to others, or it being taken away from us. And then again, going back and going, okay, well, can you give us this? Can you allow us to teach ourselves in your universities? We need to be trying to establish our own education of systems of learning and ways of cognitive understanding, because there are different ways we learn. I don't mean for us to simply just go to books as well. There are so many videos, the YouTube videos generously given by some of our brilliant scholars, Dr. Browder being one of them. You can go and access all of these, Chancellor Williams, Ivan van Sertima, all these are on YouTube. I'm speaking widely now to the people that's outside listening to this. Do not sit and just be consuming distracting information when you have access now, thanks to the internet and what it does. You can narrow it down to listening to Dr. Ben Yosef Yohanan, listening to Dr. Francis West Creslin. You have these things. So we in terms of us re-educating ourselves, we don't have to, if we don't have access, because I know Guyana, there's that one blessed bookshop, Austin, thank God for it. But there are other ways for us to access scholarly and community work as well. And one of the things I'll just finish on as well is just to, again, I must stress to recognize the value that the people themselves have. What are those peoples present in the village, like say like Buxton or any of those villages? What are they doing? Who's talking to them? Are they in the conversation, or is it just top down? Because what we come from, where we come from, you had to make sure that the entire village was in that room and understand what they need. So we need to start thinking differently about power and collectivism. I was so pleased to hear Brother Nicholas talk about the cooperatives, because it was in my brief to mention the cooperatives and self-help as well. So we need to move those systems, but recognize that we're starting from ground. We are doing what Walter Rodney taught us, Baba Walter Rodney taught us about groundings. That means going back, what he did, come out of this box, which is the TV now, the screen, the books, the whatever, the academic institution, and go and talk to the people, know what's really outside there. And that you know, Guyana really needs to for me, talking specifically about Guyana, to go back and understand what people like him and others of our leaders were trying to do. And in a wider scale, the world, as Black people, need to look at some of our works that are already there, examples for us to draw from. Thank you. Sorry about going on too much.
That's okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Ya Asantewa. And I want to use the opportunity to get in some of the questions from our participants. Brother Fitz Alert is asking, well, he's saying a daunting question is that of class and ethnicity. How do we approach the issue of centricity in the face of cross-cutting class interests? Who would like to respond to that question?
May I say this? I think I mentioned to Sister Olive, and this is Guyana, because now I have grown up with Guyanese more than I've grown up with Dominicans, because in the diaspora, that's what happens. You have your Guyanese family, your Jamaican family, your African-American family, you have oneness. Indo-Guyanese in the United States are seen as people of color. For whatever reason, of course, we know the role of colonialism and pitting Afro-Guyanese against Indo-Guyanese. We know that the Central Intelligence Agency, whether we like it or not, played its role. Cherry Jagan and Burnham were in one party. That's the reality. That's why Joey Jagan's godfather is Forbes Burnham, or was Forbes Burnham. Guyana had an election about a month ago, 2 months ago, maybe more, and it has not been called. Because in Guyana is the fear by Afro-Guyanese of being dispossessed by a government that is not receptive. And Indo-Guyanese likewise feel that if Afro-Guyanese, which is what they perceive PNC happen to be, retain power, they will be dispossessed. So you have two positions. Between the two, they shall never meet. Well, that is a decision we make. Because if Indo-Guyanese understand that for Guyana to be a stable, prosperous nation, they cannot but reckon, accept, and be respectful of Afro-Guyanese and the primacy that they feel in their own land. And likewise, Afro-Guyanese consider that born Guyanese of Indian extraction have a similar right. Then we only have created the conditions for interness and inter-ethnic conflict. IDPADA-G is in a very good position because it's led by conscious people of humanitarian reaching and instinct to create that sort of platform where Indo and Afro-Guyanese can sit and say, folk, the colonial construct of winner takes all that we've been given has not worked over these 50 years of independence. Let us create a Truth and Reconciliation Commission so we can have Indo-Guyanese learn to respect Afro-Guyanese and vice versa, and so that we can have equal share in the countries of our birth. That is, I think, the mission in part of IDPADA-G. The other mission of IDPADA-G that I want to compliment IDPADA-G on is what they've started to do in the Garveyite tradition of do for self, the credit union. We were dispossessed. And Brother Browder makes the excellent point. Brother Browder, I humbly concede that oftentimes, because of the lack that we experienced during colonialism and Jim Crow, as soon as we have some money, we buy the big house, buy the big car, and we have nothing in the bank. And we don't own the bank either. And so we live on the edge. But by the credit union that IDPADA-G has done, I believe it's beginning to lay the infrastructure to dismantle the whole idea of not being possessed of the financial acuity in way of skill and the ability to aggregate savings, which you can then invest into small business, housing, industry, agriculture. As with Prince George's County, Brother Browder, you must know that I'm part of a collective to do exactly that. With the Speaking Airmen, to train our folk in aerospace, and it is not necessarily true. I'm not sure when last you've been in Prince George's County, but there's quite a dynamic small business and mid-sized business owned, infrastructure owned by Black folk in restaurants. I want to give you the good news this evening, the very good news this evening. The only aerospace manufacturing plant within 100 miles of the White House tonight, as I speak to you, I'm pleased to report to you. You can go online after this meeting. Is owned by an aerospace engineer who came to the United States from Jamaica. His father served in the Royal Air Force during World War II. He spoke at our breakfast last year. He maintained the Hubble for 21 years. a black man from the West Indies, built a 40,000 square foot factory, 150 scientists. He's the sole owner, and he's built, listen to this, a single person spaceship, the only one of its kind in the United States. I've been in the prototype, and that came from his management of the Hubble. He has 4 chip factories. He bakes his own chips because of the sensitive nature of his work. He can't import chips from anywhere else. So within his factory are 4 chip factories. He bakes his own chips. Humble gentleman from Kingston, Jamaica, Robert Rashford of Genesis Engineering Solutions. So as Brother Browder said, our history did not begin with slavery, indeed, our history goes back to Genesis. Thank you very much.
I would like to, may I offer a little comment here? I think we need to problematize some of these points that were being made, particularly about the status of our inter-ethnic relationships, the question of class, and more importantly, the issue of erasure. I think Michelle said to us that we need to use terms like, or return to a conversation on things like imperialism, democratic socialism, ideas about egalitarian strategies for human collaboration. I think that after the politics of the 70s, the early post-colonial politics in Guyana, particularly the period of decolonization and the problems with perceptions of the Burnham administration, we have shied away from terms like socialism. We have shied away from terms like neocolonialism as we entered into 1992 and the PPP years since. The relationship between African and Indian folks in Guyana has to be addressed, not in a superficial way. It has to be addressed in the fact that Indo-Guyanese are arriving in Guyana whilst African Guyanese are still in slavery and are being sold a bill of sale that involves all of those stereotypes and mythologies and caricatures about Black people. We've got to face that. When we look at Rodney and the early work of Chetty and Forbes, it is about finding a commonality. The fact that they are working people, the embryonic proletariat, the rural peasants. If we don't face those kinds of ideological things, we are going to be just dealing with the surface and really reinforcing the silos that we live in. We use the word Apanjat loosely. Apanjat was not of domestic generation. Apanjat came out of the words of Indo-Indian diplomatic folks who came to visit Guyana to see what were the conditions of their Indian, folks from India who were working in the indentured kind of arena. So I think we need to have a much more substantial conversation about Indo-African relationships, about the loss that took place with the separation of the PPP in 1953. And this leads back to what is now emerging, what I've seen in Guyana. For example, there's an article that was published in the Indo-Caribbean Diaspora News. The writer is a guy called Ramdan Jagisar. And he says, African slaves did not build Trinidad or Tobago. As a matter of fact, slaves didn't build a damn thing. Now, that is erasure. If we talk about Rodney and celebrate Rodney, Rodney talks about enslaved Africans humanizing that coast without Mack truck, without front end loaders, just with shovel and muscle. So I think we need to have a period of co-discovery to undermine the emerging manifestations of erasure. There's too much of erasure going on. We saw it in Rice. We see it in Jagasar's piece about Africans doing nothing. We talk about Africans having no science and technology. Michelle speaks about this notion that Africans are lazy. Tom Dalgetty, brother Ross Tom Dalgetty, has been talking to us for years about African science and technology in the gold and diamond mining industry. We don't talk about that. So I think that we have to combat erasure. And in the process of combating erasure, it has to be co-discovery. There's a young scholar out at the Central Coastal University who is looking at the African experience, the kind of Gullah experience, which is an experience that connects us from the forts in West Africa right across to the Palenques in South America. And they're talking about an archaeology. Where is the archaeology of the Americas, particularly the African experience in the Americas? We need to have those kinds of applied methods as we deal with the challenge, the crucial challenge of erasure, this systematic, sometimes silent effort to erase from the national consciousness the role of African people beyond song and dance. So this leads us to the strategy that Michelle was speaking about, education. Education, we know, you could have three dimensions to it. You have the formal, the non-formal, and the informal. A lot of this mythology and stereotyping and caricature is being vitalized, energized in the realms of non-formal and informal education. I could remember Tony speaking to us at IDPADA-G a few years ago about the significance of Black Panther, the movie. There was more to Black Panther, the movie, than the Guyanese actress or that. It was about much more than that. So we need to look at the roles we can play in non-formal and informal education. This means that we've got to begin to speak to content. Content in Guyana, media content in Guyana, is not as attractive as it can be. One must note that during this COVID-19 lockdown, one has seen a lot of initiative, a lot of original work coming out from NCN. This shows that that is possible. So as we move forward to combat erasure, to intensify and deepen the discourse about Indo-African relationships in Guyana, to intensify and deepen a conversation on an equitable system or ideology or philosophy for social organization, we need to be working in this space of non-formal and informal education. Today, young Bill Rogers has a calypso out there now in which he makes the point that racism is worse than the pandemic. You know, think that through. And to close, to go with all of this, we need to have a regeneration, and I'm abundantly thankful for Michelle. We need to have a regeneration in terms of governance. Our approaches to governance, as Michelle pointed out, is top-down. You know, we go to people with, this is what we're going to do for you. We know where the pain comes from, the shoe that pinches. Let's go to the folks. Instead of mobilizing them in Durban Park to say, this is what we're going to do for you. Let's go to our people and find out what it is, prioritize, establish the monitor and feedback mechanisms to do what, you know, my alumni friend from Queens College, Nicholas, drew to our attention. So as we deal with these problems, we have to get to a point where we take the knee off of the neck of the Guyanese working people. And unfortunately, Guyanese working people of African ancestry have had that knee on their neck for an inordinately long time. If we allow erasure to gallop ahead as it is, we are doing our people an injustice. And if you want a place to start, let us look at the spaces that are open in the non-formal and informal education system. So that's my contribution to the reflections that I've heard from my brothers. We cannot approach the Indo and African Guyanese thing in simplistic terms. Let us remember that they too have suffered a lot of this anti-blackness. Speak to a Madrasi about what his realities are in Guyana. Speak to a young Indian woman who may have fallen in love with a black guy, or conversely, a young black woman who fell in love with an Indian guy. Those are the kinds of issues. Why is it that Mahakali is the not so respected aspect of Hinduism in Guyana? Those relationships are complex, and we have to address them through co-discovery. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cambridge. And I wanted to use this information to say that IDPADA-G's youth committee and IDPADA-G in general is taking the opportunity to do some re-educating ourselves, because every Thursday night at 7 p.m. we have a program called Spill the Facts, where we use the opportunity to give our young audiences factual content about our history, about how we see ourselves as people of African descent. And also in terms of developing new structures to rebuild some of the lost legacy of, for example, the village movement. The International Decade for People of African Descent is currently in the process of establishing a community development system for African Guyanese villages. And I am the community development officer for IDPADA-G actually. And so my work, my area of specialty is in urban and rural planning. And so we are using this opportunity to go back to our villages to see what they're lacking and to plan them for now. And of course, for the future in the way that we would like to see them develop in the way that our ancestors have taught us to develop villages. And I want to use the opportunity to bring in Mr. Elliott here, because I want to hear from you in terms of the youth perspective about where we are currently as youth of African descent, and what is the kind of work that we need to do to get from point A to point B to where we would want to see ourselves in the future.
All right, thank you, Elsie. So in an international review of modern sociology in volume 16, they spoke about, they assessed the situation in Guyana, and they ascribed the situation to a blatant system, as we've explored earlier, that ascribed influence and value based off of pigmentation, place of birth, education. And yet oftentimes the Europeans who perpetuated these systems were uneducated, and they only got wealth or dollars based off of the fact that they inherited it, and they did not necessarily work for those dollars that they've had. But coming to where we are as youth, I think we are in a key position, Guyana and globally, in the sense that, one, there is an international decade now for people of African descent that was officially designated by the United Nations. And so that gives you the sort of socioeconomic platform to mount your challenges and to have them recognized and to have official finances that would be disbursed to help mitigate some of those challenges. And we could see that the Black Lives Matter movement in the US is being championed by a lot of young persons. And locally, we can see events like Curl Fete, though they may seem like just, an event you can go to and just have a good time, see natural hair. It really helps the culture and the spirit of the Black person to recognize that who you are, your curls, your darkness, your skin, it's not inherently less than. You know, it has a lot of value to it. And so that helps to rekindle the flame of racial pride, not to be racist or Afrocentric or exclusionary, but to be proud within yourself and to be able to say, I'm a Black person with curly hair, and I'm okay with that, and that's a great thing. Moving on, recently, about 2 weeks ago, the youth in Buxton recently concluded a farmers market that was about 3 days long, and that goes to the spirit of cooperativism that I was speaking about earlier. You know, you have these resources available to you, the land and the skills to farm, and you've come together now and you decided that we would no longer depend on others to supply us with food, but we are going to generate our own food, and hopefully coming out of that farmers market, they can have formal co-ops that would then be able to have secondary and tertiary items produced from that raw material that their farmers market can generate. So overall, I can say that though we have been disenfranchised, the youth are becoming more conscious and they're taking every step that they can, given the circumstances, to make a better life for the general Afro-Guyanese public. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Thank you, Mr. Elliott. Earlier in the conversation, Dr. Ya Asantewa mentioned neocolonialism, and just now, Mr. Elliott mentioned the United Nations. I want to hear from you, our panelists. Can we trust these multilateral institutions like the UN and its High Commission on Human Rights to support us in this fight for dismantling the global anti-Black system? What are your thoughts on that?
If I may, I think these multilateral organizations are what we make them. We know that the UN came out of what Elliott in the term of art called the White Civil War, World War II. And it was pushed in great measure by progressive people. You know, progressive people like Eleanor Roosevelt were part of that. Of course, Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia was part of that. Of course, the major Western powers and the Soviet Union had a veto. With the growth of the African continent, we have independent nations and others in Latin America and the Caribbean, we now have a lot more space than we once had. And so I always say that, like Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without demand. And the way in which one makes an incisive demand is intrinsically related to how organized one is, right? And that's why the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was fair. Bobby Seale was in the US Air Force, he came out. Huey Newton read all the law he could read, having not gone to Georgetown or any law school. But he equipped himself. That's why they were able to go to the State House in Sacramento armed. And so they came back and changed the law to say you couldn't carry long guns around. But organization, education, by our communities in Africa, in the diaspora here, will push multilateral organizations in the direction that we want them to go. If we come in, we are splintered, we are ruled by neo-colonial puppets. And let me just say something about that. When I came to the United States, I roomed with 2 Nigerians. Nigeria is the largest Black country on earth. But on this panel here this evening, I guarantee there's been more Pan-African work done. I must say this, if you regret anybody, you can, and I don't say this disrespectfully, I say it more with regret. There's been more Pan-African work done on this panel in aggregation than all of Nigeria. The 2 brothers in the rooming house, one was Yoruba, the other one was Igbo. They had no Nigerian consciousness. Their consciousness was tribal. So forget about Pan-African consciousness. I was talking South Africa, civil rights and Black power. They had no interest in that. The interest was to start clubbing from Thursday night through Sunday, and from Monday through Thursday, they would ask me, Gabe, you've got any salt? Gabe, you've got any sugar? Gabe, you've got any bread? I was an African in the diaspora, looking at Africa as one construct, trying to make a meaningful contribution to its liberation. And here were born Africans who knew nothing about the diaspora, nothing about Guyana, nothing about the Caribbean. Their intersection with African-American culture was the music. Don't ask them about joining the NAACP. Don't ask them about any anti-apartheid struggle. But Africans, Black Panthers, that's a fantasy. So I just come back to say, with regard to multilateral organizations, like I said, with regard to forming that nexus for a African universities network, maybe on YouTube with Brother Browder, with all the excellent work he's doing that needs to be learned, with Brother Cambridge, with that sort of deep and pool of profundity in struggle and the rights of working people, with yourself, Elsie, and Sister Asantua, I believe we can start that movement. It has to be organization. That is how they'll respond to the demands we make, where our demands are coherent, organized, and learned.
Gabriel, one quick question. The experience you had with the Nigerians, how many years ago, would you say they obtained today? Because some of the leading voices in the George Floyd struggle are sort of young Nigerian women athletes who are making their voice heard. Generations change. You know, for example, as the non-aligned movement, which Forbes, Burnham, and Tito, and Nehru, and whatever, helped to influence the United Nations to where it is today, that they could be speaking of global issues such as the Sustainable Development Goal. I take your point that the multilateral organizations like the World Bank, like the United Nations, like the IMF, will only respond if we get in there in an organized way. Thanks to people, and this is not now, this is about blocking erasure. Thanks to the effort of people like Fred Wills and Rashley Jackson, and that early Sridhar Ramphal, that early Guyanese professional diplomats, that we saw a lot of change in our hemisphere. The recognition of Cuba, the recognition of China, the diplomatic relations with Russia. So I have faith that following your recommendation about organization, that we could get the United Nations, and that we could build some degree of trust. But remember, trust, but verify.
Yes,
trust,
indeed.
But verify.
Thank you, thanks.
Thank you for your contributions on that question. We have spoken a lot about the different facets of the system that are affecting people of African descent. And Mr. Gabriel Christian gave a suggestion for the way forward, as well as in each presentation, there were some suggestions. But as we're coming to the end of the discussion, I want to hear from us, since the protests have started since George Floyd's death, and there have been movements all around the world because of it. How do we sustain this type of momentum? So what do we do from now going forward to ensure that the movement does not die, that it grows, and that it goes in the direction that we want it to go as people of African descent, that it is not co-opted by another group? What are your thoughts?
I'd like to add a couple of insights regarding the protests. I made a couple of very basic observations. I've seen a number of protests and demonstrations in my lifetime, but these protests that we've seen the last 2 to 3 weeks have been incredible in that it has become a worldwide movement, and that there are more white people involved in this movement than I've ever seen before. And I would guess that there's several reasons for that. One has to do with the power of the image. One of the reasons why everyone is rallying to the issue regarding the murder of George Floyd is because of that videotape. You better believe that there are hundreds of people who have died in similar circumstances, but no one knows about it because it was not recorded. And there are probably thousands of people who are subjected to the same police brutality, but were not killed and are permanently injured, but we don't know about it because there's no videotape. So what we're seeing is a response to images that has affected the psyche of people all around the world. One of the other reasons I feel why there's so many white people aligned with our movement now is that for the past 2 to 3 generations, white folk have grown up listening to Black music. And there is something in the music. There is a spirit, an African spirit that is carried in the music, that is internalized by everyone who hears it. White young people buy more rap music than Black folk. So by all of these white people listening to the jazz, listening to the blues, listening to hip hop, listening to rap, they are beginning psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually to align themselves to the energy of African people. So they can relate now. They can feel our pain, and they're on the front line. So how do we marshal these forces? So we have to be aware of what's happening and the energy seen and unseen that is moving through and impacting everybody. And be aware of the fact that we've got to work on multiple levels simultaneously. Yes, we have to intellectualize this process, but there's also a spiritual component, which my sister Yal Santuar referenced earlier. We've got to tap into that, because the only reason that we're still alive today is because of this African spirit, which our oppressors could not diminish. So that has been our strength, our core strength. So we've got to embrace that and build on that and use that energy to help us shape the world we want our children's children to inherit. And the last thing that I'll say is that we have to eliminate all fear, particularly fear of death. Because if you understand life from an African-centered perspective, then you will know that there is no death. There is the continuation of life. Life is continuously recycled. So what that means, and it may be a bitter pill for some people to swallow, but it's something that I feel compelled to begin to talk about more publicly, and shift the consciousness of our folk away from a European religious perspective into an African-centered spiritual perspective. And so let me say this, and I trust that you will take what I'm saying in the manner in which I'm presenting it. The Judeo-Christian religious system has propagated a belief that man was separated from their creator and man was born in sin. And I'm here to say tonight publicly that that is a lie. That is a falsehood. When you begin to study the spiritual systems of indigenous people all around the world, there's no concept of original sin. There's no concept of people having been separated from their creator. And so what I'm suggesting is that we begin to look at spirit from a non-European perspective and begin to understand what that means, how it has always manifested itself within our lives and our affairs, and begin to study the means by which we can cultivate that awareness within ourselves in order to shape the world that we want to bring into manifestation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Browder. Dr. Cambridge, would you like to comment here?
Well, you know, this is deep stuff. The fact that we are recognizing that there are other ways of looking at our spirituality. When Gabriel mentioned about his Nigerian brothers, a fact, Nigeria has more Anglicans than any other country in the world. The Anglican Church was the major vector for the colonialization of our African, of Nigerians. We've come back to the point. We've got to resist efforts at erasure. We've got to recognize that when you confront erasure, you're going to get massive pushback. Epithets or terms like Afrocentric are going to be thrown at you, meaning that you are partial. I want to say that let us look at the history of the founding of the African American Studies. African American Studies was a movement within the American university system that set out to reclaim and re-energize the African experience. Over the 40 odd years of its presence in the American Academy, so many other marginalized peoples, so many marginalized issues became clear in focus. Women's studies is a function of the African American studies. Asian and Latin and Hispanic studies emerged out of that. So the Black struggle is one that encourages solidarity. And what we are seeing, as Anthony points out, in these marches are manifestations of solidarity. So one has to recognize this. One has not to let one's guard drop, but we have to move forward, maintaining the resistance that has been part of our ethos for thousands of years. So again, I close. The big struggle, the big fight is a fight against erasure. That is the contemporary issue. We got to tip our hat to people like Michelle, who decided that she's going to give us other platforms on which to express ourselves. Let us take her point seriously and work on that non-formal and informal education realm. Therein lies our opportunities. Therein lies our next level of creativity. And Anthony, if this young woman, this young scholar ever moves forward with her idea of doing the archaeology of the African experience in Guyana, I hope that you'd be able to step up and give her some advice.
I surely will. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cambridge. Dr. Michelle Asantewa, what are your final thoughts?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elsie, and thank you, everybody. I mean, it's wonderful how, you know, the spirit is aligning. And I just want to say, yeah, consider the importance of women as well in this struggle and in this movement, and how women have been very much at the front, including in the inner spirit, the vibration coming from George Floyd when he called out for his mother, which is my understanding aligns with the time of her passing. So in that, we as Africans would not see these things as coincidental, but as crucial and aligning with the cycle that is life. I take Brother Anthony's point very seriously, and I think you should all. And I continue, like you said, Brother Anthony, that once you found out and once you knew, once you read certain books, it's like stolen legacy. Seriously, really, your life then becomes a total commitment to dismantling the said erasures that Brother Viber is talking about, as well as embracing practically our own traditions, dismantling in our minds and in our hearts and in every aspect of us, those falsehoods, those premises upon which our dehumanization has been built. And that has been done criminally, especially. We must remember that we were enslaved and then forced into abstract religions. And we were still able to say, okay, I see with that, how that, some of it I can connect to. We were maintaining our traditions. So what is happening now, this is how I have been observing this, because I never saw the recording of this murder. And I'm thankful for that, because my ancestors saw fit to not enable me to see it. So I was distracted otherwise. In other words, I was preparing actually for courses and classes that were in sync with what's going on. A course on James Baldwin, and I'm sure some of you will know James Baldwin and his Fire Next Time and all of his work throughout, you know, that has been talking about how the dehumanization through so many ways of Africans. Toni Morrison course, which she's been doing, her book on Beloved talks about the disremembered ancestors, as well as doing a course on African women resistance leaders. So I was doing back-to-back 3 different courses that were speaking to this time. And all of those, for example, those women resistance leaders that I was speaking about, like my namesake, Ya Santo, and that's another thing we ought to be considering, ourselves as our names and the meaning of our names and the vibration that we're carrying when we're carrying certain names, when we are carrying certain energies in our beings. We need to start unraveling these and to get with what is understood as assonance, what we do know, and stop pretending that we do not know certain things, because we know, for example, that white Jesus don't make no sense anymore. It just does not make sense to us. We know this, but we are holding on to this. And in a lot of the conversations that I see going on, it appears that racism for everybody only impacts you know, the economy, the skin color, the certain things, but somehow not the religion. It hasn't factored into the religion. We need to look at if it's everywhere, where is it most? Where is it most, and how is it impacting us? Or anti-blackness, let's call it that in its buzz self. How is it impacting us? That image that Brother Anthony was talking about, the image. Yeah, and you transfer the image. I had a conversation, rather WhatsApp exchange with my sister who was asking me about how has it become about statues. I had to say it's not just about the statues. The statues are a morsel, a tiny little part of a bigger thing, but that is the energy and the symbol of these statues floating around in our face. Queen Victoria in Guyana is one of them that drives me crazy and needs to be taken down. And when I posted and suggested this on Facebook, the comeback that I had was, and this is again to do with the ignorance and the need for this education. They were indeed coming, and I'm not trying to be divisive because I'm not into that. Coming from Indo-Guyanese, like, well, some Indo-Guyanese would say, get rid of coffee and get rid of Damon. Well, for those of you who don't know, and this is just to make sure that the Facebook listeners or whoever's listening do understand, there is a complete difference between because what I mentioned was about getting rid of Gandhi, is that we need to understand what coffee stood for and fought for, and what Damon, he fought against apprenticeship. So the fact is that in Guyana, this lack of total understanding about the African contribution is ridiculous, and it needs to stop. And we need to start beginning to have those conversations about our spirituality, the water mama. We need to openly talk about these things, because these are embedded in the very fabric of every single African. And also the fact that the comfort tradition, the African Guyanese comfort tradition, acknowledges not only the African essence and the African spirit, but it also acknowledges the fact that they were indigenous peoples there, that they were the East Indians came there. It acknowledges the wider European spirit. So when you look at that total system, it is one that is all embracive, all inclusive, and should in no way, shape, and form be marginalized and left for a few people to try and emote and understand about. We need to stop this ignorance, this willful ignorance, and step forward in this moment. This moment, what you're seeing is total ancestral energies all across the world. The energies is the energies of our ancestors that are speaking to us. The energies of our ancestors are saying enough is enough. They might not seem that they seem like remote to you, but they're not. They are there in the midst. And I should stress, and I would say this and then leave, that it was in this period that we were able for the first time to have a global libation a pouring of libation to the African ancestors in this very period, because usually it's done by the children of the Sun Collective, led by my Baba Menes. They usually just do this themselves in New York, but imagine this period enabled us to each in our respective spaces to pour libation and acknowledge the fact that we would not be here was it not for those ancestors that were dragged across the Middle Passage. And I stress finally that the role of the women continue to be something that needs also to be recognized in what's going on, because the power of the feminine divine, which is the water mama energies that runs Guyana, that we don't seem to understand. The stagnation that Guyana finds itself in, furthermore, is because we decided to go down extractive industries route instead of the route of agriculturalism, the route that is about environmentalism, the route that is about nurturing Mother Nature. That's why we're in this stagnation about where should we go. What's going on is a spiritual as well as a physical and a material experience. And we need to recognize that and celebrate that. And that's really all I've got to say. Sorry I became so passionate.
Thank you, Dr. Ya Asantewa. We definitely appreciated all that you had to say. Mr. Christian, what are your final words?
Well, I mean, I'm just speechless by the sister when she talked about the water mama. I just want to say thank you, Brother Browder. Thank you, Sister Santua, Brother Elliot, Sister Olive, who's in the background, and certainly Elsie, you've done yourself this evening and been an outstanding host.
And Dr.
Did I say Dr. Cambridge, Brother Cambridge?
It's okay, we both have Dominican connections. My grandmother's a Dominican.
Well, so you're telling me you're a Pala Walla?
Yeah. Marigo.
Marigo, that's where my wife's from. My wife's from Marigo. That's right. What's your grand? Well, anyway, let's not go down that way. Get caught in the weeds. I see Brother Browder's laughing at me. But listen, Brother Browder, Dr. Cambridge, Sister Santo, Dr. Tobisun Elliott, this has been powerful. I just want to associate myself with what Sister Santo said about extractive industry and what it does to the land. Because I was in Guyana recently, outstanding trip. Thanks again to IDPADA-G. And one of the things that I heard was the threat made by certain segments of the Indo-Guyanese community to isolate and deny food to the Afro-Guyanese who are more urbanized. And I said to myself, are these the same Afro-Guyanese who built the canal system and built the wealth of Guyana in agriculture? That somehow we've become so separate from the land that someone could hold that sword of Damocles over our head, that they deny us food because we have left the land. So the credit union, you're well on your way. The next thing is the IDPADA-G farm. And we'll find ways to partner you with African farmers and find ways so we can prosper the food security of the Guyanese nation, but in particular, reconnect with the land. The spirit of the land and of agriculture, Sister Santua, it's a spiritual battle. And when I spoke of the Nigerians, Dr. Cambridge, you have to understand that there's a scam called 419 scam that our brothers in that particular great country, potentially great country, have almost become synonymous with. And I asked myself if they're so busy themselves in being productive in science and technology and organization, as opposed to the layer of filthy lucre and easy money. Where would we be as an African diaspora? Where would we be as an African nation? We have to discipline ourselves. So I'm very happy to hear that there's some Nigerian sisters. I love Nigeria, I love all Africa, but we have to discipline ourselves. We have to operate in struggle with a degree of integrity, because a lot of people have fought and died and bled and sweated and toiled for us to be here. It's like the comment Brother Browder made about Prince George's County. That if you become a county executive and you have hegemony over people's money and you have political authority, that you cannot have that political authority be bastardized, prostituted for personal gain. One has to be unselfish in struggle. One has to give one's life for the people. Because anything short of that self-sacrificing leadership, that servant leadership, is to betray those who died for our freedom. In this moment, we are in the middle of an organic uprising. In the old days, we had the Urban League, the Niagara Movement, and the NAACP, Southern Leadership Conference, Dr. King, Ralph Abernathy, Andrew Young. There was leadership that could go to the White House. LBJ would sign the Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, give 1 pen to Dr. King, 1 pen to Ralph Abernathy. Right now, maybe that's good because of CONTELPRO. They don't know who to get. They can't go after Dr. Browder or Mr. Cambridge. It's the leadership, it's leaderless, almost, organic from the grassroots, just uprising. So that is a plus in one sense, because you can't just bump off one leader and then collapse the whole movement. But on the other hand, there's always the danger of lack of cohesiveness. And so I expect to see this movement to throw up new leaders, leaders who will be in the great spirit of our ancestors, who will not betray the cause, and who will work assiduously for victory, for justice, the destruction of the prison industrial complex that is destroying the African-American society, in particular its manhood, that will put more funds into the policies that will help our farmers regain some primacy, help our HBCUs become more wedded to our development, and the Pan-African mission, as Dr. Browder just referenced, not get lost in the weeds of being the president of this and the president of that and the president of nothing. So I just want to conclude by saying it's been a humbling experience to be here with all of you, dearly beloved. And indeed, we did not begin with the Judeo-Christian ethic. Brother Browder is right. We went way before that, and we have to plumb the depths of our spirituality. And someone used the term, the DNA. The DNA of our origin has to be examined. And in that process of self-realization, in that process of self-actualization, in that process of self-understanding, we will grow strong with that resistance, which has carried us through victory all these years. I'm optimistic that we are on the cusp of great things, though great challenges remain. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Christian. Mr. Elliott, what are your final words?
All right, thank you so much, Elsie. I must give thanks to the other learned members of this panel who, though I managed to share a bit, imparted a great deal of knowledge on me, and I'm forever grateful for that. But just to dial back a bit on what Brother Browder had mentioned about this being a response to images and to music, what these things have in common is media. And even Dr. Cambridge is saying that we need to combat erasure, right? That's what you're saying. But the way to combat erasure is through media. You own newspapers, you own radio stations, you own any form of media that can disseminate information. He referenced something from the Indo-Caribbean Diaspora News, which in my opinion is a propaganda media outlet that's solely targeted at erasure, but that's for another conversation. But the idea I'm getting at is that you own these things so that you can propel your narrative to counter this erasure. And while you own these newspapers, you also need to sit with the youth, sit with the children, and pass on this knowledge to them. Pass on your stories, teach them some of the challenges that you've had. You need to sit. Now is the time to sit and be open with children. These are the challenges that we've had as a people. This is how we've overcome them. And these are some of the challenges that still remain. And these are my suggestions on how you can target these challenges when you get older. So it would then fill that bridge in passing that baton of leadership from older to younger generations. I'd also like to touch a little bit on representation. Brother Gabriel spoke a bit about representation in technology. Representation as a young person coming up in the STEM field, it's extremely important because it gives you hope and motivation, seeing somebody like yourself on the other end of your journey. And what it does for you as well is that you have persons now who are able to guide and nurture your mind to think in a way that could solve the problems that not only you might face as a community, but as a people, as African people, as people of African ancestry, and more importantly, as Guyanese. So when you see yourself on the other end, you're more receptive to that sort of training. Lastly, I'd like to conclude by encouraging intentional spending. We have not been as fortunate as some others to have this sort of generational wealth bequeathed to us. And so we need to be intentional about the dollars we have earned and where we want to put them, because where we put them is where we put our effort. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Elliott. And I want to use this opportunity to invite all the persons who are present right now for this discussion to tune in on Thursday, 25th June, that's next Thursday at 7 p.m. by Zoom and Facebook Live for our Spill the Facts program, where we are talking about confronting anti-blackness in 2020, the African male experience. Thursday that just went, we did the African female experience, and now we're doing the African male experience. So please tune in to participate in that, and also follow our social media pages. We are on Facebook and Instagram. Use the hashtag use the curly A at IDPADA-G, IDPADA-G, to find our Facebook page and our Instagram page so that you can keep up with all of the different discussions that we will be having, or activities, and also the content that we are putting out there to combat erasure. Thank you so much to all of our panelists, Dr. Vibert Cambridge, Dr. Michelle Ya Asantewa, Mr. Anthony Browder, Mr. Gabriel Christian, and Mr. Nicholas Elliott, for giving us a wealth of information, for having this deep and meaningful conversation, and for giving even me a learning opportunity this evening. And thank you so much to our audience. Without you, we would not be able to have these conversations, because you are the one that listen and participate. And we are so grateful that you have taken the time to do that. Thank you so much from IDPADA-G. We appreciate this very much, and please do continue to support our work. Have a good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you.